Good evening, fellow history lovers, and welcome to tonight's reflective journey through time. I'm so pleased you've chosen to join me once again for a quiet waltz into the past. Tonight, we begin tracing the long, intricate road that led to the decline and eventual fall of one of history's most extraordinary civilizations, the Roman Empire. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Are you nestled in bed, unwinding after a long day? Or perhaps you're simply seeking a moment of quiet during the wakeful hours. However you've come, it's an honor to be your guide. If you appreciate immersive storytelling, where history is not merely recited but felt, woven gently with thoughtful narration, I invite you to subscribe and return for future episodes. There are many more chapters in our shared human story to explore together, but for now, let us shift our gaze back over 2 millennia to the Eternal City. Close your eyes for a moment. Picture the Rome of the 2nd century CE, still radiant in the golden afterglow of its imperial zenith. The marble temples shimmer in the Mediterranean sun. The Forum is alive with the murmur of debate, trade, and everyday life. Proud legions marched beyond the city gates, extending Roman law and language to the farthest frontiers. It must have seemed in those days that Rome would endure forever. Yet, as history reminds us, even the mightiest empires are not immune to decay. The fall of Rome was not the result of a single catastrophic event, but rather the slow unraveling of institutions, traditions, and cohesion. A decline that unfolded across centuries through political intrigue, military overreach, economic instability, and social transformation. In tonight's episode, we'll gently trace the early threads of this unraveling. We'll meet emperors both wise and reckless, soldiers of valor and ambition, and ordinary Romans who lived through extraordinary times. So take a deep breath. Let the concerns of the present moment slip away as we journey back through time to the twilight of Roman greatness. Our story begins in the waning years of the 2nd century CE. On the surface, the Roman Empire appeared resplendent. The borders were stable, the economy was flourishing, and a series of capable rulers, later known as the 5 Good Emperors, had presided over an age of prosperity and relative peace. But beneath this facade of invincibility, the cracks had already begun to form. A key fault line was the imperial office itself. For generations, Rome had been governed by men of virtue, leaders like Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, who valued duty over indulgence. But when Marcus Aurelius died in 180 CE, he was succeeded by his son, Commodus, a transition that marked a dramatic departure from the model of the philosopher-king. Commodus came to power at the age of just 19. Unlike his father, he exhibited little interest in the burdens of statecraft. Vain and erratic, Commodus fancied himself a demigod and a gladiator. He frequently appeared in the arena, dispatching opponents who had been ordered to lose. He renamed Rome Colonia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus, and went so far as to rename the months of the year in his own honor. Under his reign, the serious business of governance was neglected. The Senate, once a respected advisory body, was ignored and diminished. The imperial administration, once anchored by law and precedent, was now adrift under the whims of a self-indulgent ruler. When Commodus was finally assassinated in 192 CE, it was too late to prevent the damage. His death did not herald a return to stability. Instead, Rome entered a period of rapid turnover and turmoil. In the decades that followed, emperors rose and fell with alarming frequency. From 235 to 251 CE alone, more than 20 emperors came and went, many meeting violent ends. Assassinations became a grim norm, with emperors installed and deposed by the Praetorian Guard, the elite imperial bodyguards originally formed to protect the emperor. They had now become kingmakers, selling the throne to the highest bidder. This political instability undermined confidence in the empire. But the crisis was not merely political. It was economic as well. For centuries, Roman prosperity had depended on agricultural production, trade networks, and the steady tribute flowing in from conquered lands. But by the 3rd century, the agricultural heart of the empire was faltering. Soil exhaustion from over-farming led to decreased yields. As rural productivity declined, many farms were abandoned. Meanwhile, emperors desperate to fund the military devalued the silver currency, causing rampant inflation and economic disarray. Trust in the money supply eroded. Rome's vast borders, stretching from Britain to the Euphrates, required enormous resources to defend. Facing constant pressure from Germanic tribes, Parthians, and other external threats, Rome poured more and more into the military. But these costs further strained the economy, creating a vicious cycle of militarization and decline. From a distance, Rome still seemed a titan. Its architecture remained awe-inspiring, its legions still marched in formation. But those who lived within its bounds increasingly sensed that the old foundations were weakening. Decline, in this case, was not dramatic collapse. It was erosion, almost imperceptible to those living day to day. Yet, history, with its long gaze, can perceive the slow bending arc of time. And by the late 3rd century, the fractures had deepened. In time, new threats emerged. As Rome struggled to regain its footing after the crisis of the 3rd century, a momentary stabilization came under the Emperor Diocletian, who attempted sweeping reforms. But even as Rome caught its breath, new enemies were gathering. Across the Rhine and Danube, the so-called barbarian tribes, long Rome's adversaries, had begun to change. Germanic peoples like the Goths, Vandals, and Franks were no longer just scattered raiders. They were becoming organized, forming large tribal confederations led by ambitious kings. In the early 4th century, the Goths, the most formidable of these groups, fled from a new and terrifying force. The Huns, nomadic horsemen from Central Asia, whose origins remain mysterious. Pressed by this new threat, the Goths sought asylum within the Roman Empire. In 376 CE, the Emperor Valens allowed them to cross the Danube and settle within imperial borders, a decision made in haste and without adequate planning. The Goths were soon mistreated by local Roman officials, and famine swept through their camps. What followed was rebellion. 2 years later, in 378 CE, the Roman and Gothic forces met at the Battle of Adrianople. The result was a catastrophe. The Roman army, led by Valens himself, was encircled and annihilated. Valens perished in battle, one of the few Roman emperors ever to die at the hands of foreign foes in open combat. Adrianople marked a turning point. Rome's aura of invincibility was shattered. Never again would the empire be able to fully control its frontiers as it had before. The Gothic presence inside the empire would become a defining feature of its final century, not an exception. It was a grim sign of things to come. More tribes now rushed to exploit Rome's vulnerability. On the last day of 406 AD, a massive force of Alans, Vandals, and Suebi poured across the Rhine, overwhelming Roman defenses like a great wave. The Germanic invaders swept over Gaul, Hispania, and other once secure provinces. The unthinkable now seemed possible. After centuries of keeping the barbarians at bay, Rome's frontiers had completely collapsed. Lands that had been Roman for over 500 years now fell under the sway of Germanic kings and warlords. Meanwhile, the Goths went from triumph to triumph. After years of wandering through the Balkans, they were now led by a shrewd and ambitious young king, Alaric, a Roman-trained tactician with a singular dream, a permanent homeland for his people. In 408, the Visigoths invaded Italy itself, the sacred heart of the empire. After 2 grueling sieges, Alaric's army stood at the gates of Rome. The Senate, which had once commanded kings and shaped the fate of nations, was reduced to begging for mercy. They offered a paltry bribe: gold, silver, silk, scarlet cloth, and pepper. According to the historian Zosimus, Alaric roared with laughter at the offer, quipping, "The thicker the hay, the easier it is mowed." He demanded a far greater ransom. The Romans, desperate, paid, but it was only a temporary reprieve. In 410, the Visigoths returned. This time, the city's gates were flung open from within by rebellious slaves. Rome fell. Alaric's army poured into the capital, burning and looting as they went. For the first time in nearly 800 years, Rome had been conquered by a foreign enemy. The shock was profound. "It is my prayer, dearest son," wrote St. Jerome, "that you may live among these things as a pilgrim, a sojourner, a citizen of Jerusalem, not of Babylon." Though the city itself still stood, the sack of Rome marked a turning point, a moment many saw as divine punishment, the gods withdrawing their favor. And the blows kept coming. In 429, the Vandals, under their king Genseric, crossed into North Africa. It was a strategic catastrophe. The province, long the breadbasket of the Western Empire, was now lost. Rome's grain supply dried up, and so did its tax revenues. With its economy in free fall and borders collapsing, the empire's position became increasingly untenable. The Vandal conquest of Carthage in 439 marked the de facto end of Roman rule in Africa. The Western Empire limped on, a shadow of its former self. By mid-century, the throne had become a grim game of musical chairs. A rapid succession of emperors tried and failed to stop the bleeding. In 475, a general named Orestes seized control of the court in Ravenna and placed his young son Romulus on the throne. The child emperor was mockingly dubbed Romulus Augustulus, Little Augustus. It was a cruel irony. The boy bore the names of both Rome's mythical founder and its first emperor, but he would also be the last. In 476, when Orestes refused demands from his barbarian mercenaries for land in Italy, they revolted. Their leader, the Germanic general Odoacer, defeated and killed Orestes, then marched on Ravenna. In a final humiliation, Romulus Augustulus was forced to abdicate. According to some accounts, Odoacer spared the boy's life, sending him into comfortable exile on a country estate. With that anticlimactic act, the Western Roman Empire came to an end. Odoacer now ruled Italy as king, nominally on behalf of the Eastern Emperor Zeno, but the dream of a unified Roman Empire, a single state encompassing the Mediterranean world, was over. And yet, the story of Rome was far from finished. The Eastern Empire, increasingly known as the Byzantine Empire, would endure for nearly 1,000 more years until its fall in 1453. Still, the fall of the West prompted deep reflection. Perhaps above all, Rome offers a cautionary tale about the dangers of imperial hubris. At the height of its power, Rome seemed eternal. Its vast size bred complacency. Cracks spread beneath the surface. A crisis of legitimacy, a widening gulf between rich and poor, the slow erosion of civic virtue and military discipline. In their arrogance, Roman leaders believed the barbarian tribes would always remain awestruck inferiors, content in Rome's shadow. They failed to imagine that those same tribes might one day eclipse them. Rome had thrived on conquest. But in time, its sprawling frontier became a liability, an impossible line to defend. And yet, even as the empire receded from the stage of history, its legacy endured. It lived on in the splendor of Constantinople, in the architecture of medieval cathedrals, in the Latin language, the law, the art, the philosophy that would shape Western civilization. Its heirs spoke new languages and worshipped new gods, but still looked back to Rome for inspiration. Even the Renaissance saw itself as the rebirth of a classical ideal that had never truly died. So rest now, dear friends, and ponder the long winding path that brought the Romans to their final destination. In the morning light, their monuments still stand in silent testimony to the heights humanity can reach, and the fragility of even the greatest of achievements. Rome reminds us that even the mightiest empires can crumble when they lose touch with the virtues and values that once made them great. The seeds of Rome's demise were planted early, growing decadence and corruption among the elite, a widening gap between rich and poor, and the gradual erosion of traditional values and institutions. These internal weaknesses left Rome brittle and vulnerable to external shocks. The military crises of the 3rd century, followed by barbarian invasions in the 4th and 5th centuries. By the time the Visigoths came knocking at the gates, Rome was already a hollow giant, its legions depleted, its bureaucracy bloated, and its economy stretched thin. The fall, when it came, was less a sudden catastrophe and more the final toppling of a rotted tree. Looking back, it's tempting to draw parallels between Rome's fall and our own time, seeing in today's social divisions and political dysfunction the same seeds of decline. And indeed, Rome's story holds enduring lessons for any society. Lessons about good governance, social cohesion, and a shared sense of civic purpose. But perhaps the deeper lesson is this: all things pass. The mightiest empires, the most glittering civilizations, are in the long run as ephemeral as morning dew, sic transit gloria mundi, thus passes the glory of the world. Yet even in its passing, Rome left an indelible mark on the world, one that endures today in our language, law, art, and architecture. The eternal city may have fallen, but its legacy lives on, a ghost whispering to us across the centuries. Let us give Rome its due, not just as a cautionary tale, but as a towering achievement of the human spirit. For nearly 1,000 years, this remarkable civilization brought law, learning, and a measure of unity to a vast swath of the globe. It gave us the Pantheon and the Colosseum, the poetry of Virgil and the philosophy of Cicero, the grandeur of Julius Caesar, and the piety of Gregory the Great. Rome was, in every sense, a monumental achievement. Though its fall was slow and painful, there is a certain poignancy in how Rome met its end, with a young emperor named after the city's founder, barbarian kings ruling in the shadows of emperors, and the Senate still meeting even as the city crumbled around it. To the very end, Rome clung to its ancient forms and traditions, a last lingering echo of a world that had passed away. The final centuries. As Constantine's sons squabbled over their inheritance, Rome's enemies grew bolder. The Sassanid Persians, under their formidable King Shapur II, launched invasions into Roman Mesopotamia and Armenia. Shapur had ascended the Persian throne as an infant and would rule for an astonishing 70 years, waging nearly constant war against Rome in an effort to reclaim lost territories. Meanwhile, along the northern frontiers, Germanic tribes like the Goths, Vandals, Franks and Saxons pressed against the borders along the Rhine and Danube. The Romans saw these tribes as uncivilized barbarians, but to the Germanic peoples, the wealthy Roman provinces were tempting targets for plunder and conquest. Around 370 AD, a fierce nomadic people called the Huns began moving westward from Central Asia. Expert horsemen and ruthless warriors, their arrival triggered a domino effect. Tribes like the Goths fled across the Danube, seeking refuge inside the empire. At first, the Romans tried to accommodate the newcomers, but tensions soon boiled over. In 378, the Eastern Emperor Valens met Gothic forces near Adrianople. It would prove one of Rome's worst military disasters. Underestimating his foe, Valens attacked prematurely, only to have his legions overwhelmed by a hail of arrows. Valens himself was slain, and Rome lost 2/3 of its eastern army, along with any remaining veneer of invincibility. The Battle of Adrianople marked a grim turning point. Though unable to seize Constantinople, the Goths roamed and pillaged the Balkan provinces at will. Rome's final decline. More tribes poured across the borders. In 406, Alans, Vandals, and Suebi crossed the frozen Rhine into Gaul. 3 years later, Alaric, king of the Visigoths, descended on Italy itself and laid siege to Rome. The Eternal City had not faced a foreign army at its gates for centuries. The shock was palpable. The Senate hurriedly assembled a ransom payment of gold, silver, silk, and pepper, and Alaric withdrew. But an imperial assassination plot shattered any hope of lasting peace. In August 410, Alaric's forces entered Rome and looted the city for 3 days. Though restrained by the standards of the time, Alaric, an Arian Christian, forbade the desecration of churches. The sack dealt a devastating blow to Roman prestige. The great Christian scholar Saint Jerome lamented that the bright light of the world was put out. Power was inexorably shifting to the eastern capital, Constantinople. But shocks kept coming. In 429, the Vandals, under King Gaiseric, crossed from Spain into North Africa with shocking ease, seizing Carthage, Rome's vital breadbasket. The loss of Africa's grain shipments was a logistical and economic disaster for Italy. The Western Empire became a hollow shell, stripped of revenue and territory. A grim parade of child emperors and military strongmen cycled through power, unable to stop the accelerating decay. The Vandals sacked Rome again in 455, and finally, in 476, the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by the German warlord Odoacer. The end and the legacy. Though the Western Roman Empire passed into history, the Eastern Empire endured as the Byzantine Empire, for nearly another 1,000 years. Some see Rome's fall as a sudden cataclysm, but it was more a drawn-out unraveling. There was no single cause, but rather a perfect storm of external threats and internal rot that slowly sapped Rome's strength. Invaders breached frontiers that had grown porous through neglect. Armies loyal to generals and warlords turned on the state. Crippling taxes and rampant inflation, driven by endless wars and devalued currency, wrecked the economy. Corruption and decadence among the elite bred resentment and unrest. Christianity's rise created vital new social bonds, but also sowed divisions and drained traditional civic participation. The story of Rome's fall is complex, but echoes across history as a cautionary tale about the impermanence of power. Historian Edward Gibbon famously wrote that Rome was brought low as much by its own hand as by foreign foes. Yet, through centuries of bloodshed and the so-called Dark Ages, Rome's legacy could never be extinguished. Latin became the basis for many European languages. The Roman alphabet endures. Christianity and church law spread far and wide. Rome's literature, architecture, science, and philosophy infused medieval and modern Western culture. When the Renaissance and Enlightenment dawned, thinkers looked back to Rome's glory for inspiration, though often selectively. Rome, the eternal city, may have fallen, but the majesty and influence of its civilization, even faded and fractured, stretch on through the ages. In a sense, the Roman Empire never truly ended. It simply evolved, diffused, and became woven into the fabric of the world it once dominated. The physical empire died, but its ideas, laws, and cultural DNA survived, remixed and reborn, shaping new nations and peoples. Rome's story is one of decline and fall, but also of a deathless legacy, history's closest example of an eternal empire. When Constantine died in 337, his empire was divided among his squabbling sons, and it would never again be truly reunited. As imperial authority fractured, the stage was set for Rome's final decline. Meanwhile, Christianity's rise swept through society, gradually replacing the ancient pagan traditions that had sustained Rome for centuries. By the late 4th century, the Roman Empire was a mere shadow of its former glory. The peaceful Pax Romana had given way to an uncertain, turbulent age. Barbarian tribes long kept at bay, Goths, Vandals, Franks, and other Germanic peoples now gathered like storm clouds on the empire's borders. These tribes had traded and fought with Rome for centuries, and were often allowed to settle inside its borders in exchange for military service. But as imperial power weakened, these arrangements strained. The balance shattered with the sudden arrival of the Huns, fierce nomadic warriors from Central Asia united under the ambitious King Attila. The Huns swept ruthlessly across Europe, pushing Gothic refugees into Roman lands. Though the Visigoths were initially welcomed in 376, tensions exploded into revolt. The disastrous Battle of Adrianople in 378 was a crushing blow. Emperor Valens rashly attacked without waiting for reinforcements, was outflanked, and killed along with 2/3 of his army. It was Rome's worst defeat since Hannibal at Cannae over 6 centuries earlier, and a grim sign of the empire's future. Decades later, the Goths marched on Rome itself. Alaric, king of the Visigoths and once Rome's ally, turned against the empire after promises of land and tribute were broken. In 410 AD, his forces sacked the Eternal City, the first foreign army to do so in nearly 800 years. The shock was profound. Rome symbolized the empire, and its fall felt like an omen of impending doom. The Christian scholar St. Jerome mourned, "If Rome can perish, what can be safe?" The sack was followed by another devastating loss. In 429, the Vandals captured North Africa, Rome's vital breadbasket. The city that once fed an empire now struggled to sustain itself, reliant on dwindling grain shipments from Egypt. With territories shrinking, revenues dried up. The empire could no longer afford its legions or grand building projects. The traditional hardy Italian farmer soldiers had vanished, replaced by sprawling estates, and the empire increasingly depended on foreign mercenaries, Goths, Huns, and others, to defend its borders. These mercenaries were a double-edged sword, often turning on Rome itself. By the late 5th century, this precarious setup spelled doom. The final act of the Western Roman Empire came in 476 AD, when the last emperor, Romulus Augustulus, a mere teenager, was forced to abdicate. Though descended from the famed Julii family, Romulus held little real power. His father, a Germanic general named Orestes, was captured and executed after refusing mercenary demands for land. Odoacer, leader of the mercenaries, then declared himself king of Italy and sent the imperial regalia back to the Eastern Emperor Zeno in Constantinople, ending the Western Empire with a whimper. Yet the Eastern Empire, the Byzantine Empire, endured for nearly 1,000 more years, until Constantinople fell to the Ottomans in 1453. The Byzantines saw themselves as the true Romans, heirs to Augustus and Trajan. But the fall of the West marked the end of an era. Rome's collapse was never the result of a single cause or person. Instead, it was a slow unraveling, death by 1,000 cuts from internal decay and relentless external pressures. At its core was a profound transformation in Roman society, from a republic of small farmers and landowners to an imperial system dominated by a privileged elite and a growing underclass. While conquest once brought slaves, plunder, and wealth, it also sowed the seeds of Rome's undoing. The vast empire became too costly to defend. A swollen military grew powerful enough to dominate politics, sparking coups and civil wars. Power shifted from the Senate to generals and their armies. As Tacitus put it, they made a desert and called it peace. This barren ground was fertile soil for Christianity, which offered spiritual hope amid instability. But waves of barbarian migrations, pushed westward by the Huns, overwhelmed the empire's fragile borders. Rome's fall was gradual, not a sudden cataclysm, but a slow fading into history's shadows. Still, Rome's legacy lived on. Its language, laws, and customs became the DNA of medieval and modern Europe. The ideal of Rome as an eternal city, a beacon of civilization, continued to captivate Western imagination. Popes and emperors would claim Rome's mantle, from the Holy Roman Empire to the Renaissance, which sought to revive classical glory. Perhaps the true measure of a civilization lies not in its longevity, but in what it leaves behind. In this sense, Rome never truly died. Its grandeur lives on in medieval cathedrals, Enlightenment institutions, and the very foundations of Western culture. Though Rome's end was messy and anticlimactic, ground down by centuries of strife, its echoes resonate through time, an immortal empire of the mind. So long as we remember the eternal city, Rome will never truly fall. His co-emperor Maximian refused to retire and tried to reclaim power. Meanwhile, the two deputy emperors, Galerius and Constantius, began jockeying for control, while waiting in the wings was Constantius's ambitious son, Constantine, who would soon reunite the empire under his own banner. The young Constantine had spent years as a virtual hostage at Diocletian's court, observing and learning from the old emperor. When his father, Constantius, died in Britain in 306, Constantine was proclaimed emperor by his troops, but he still had to contend with the other tetrarchs. Maxentius, Maximian's son, who ruled Italy, and Galerius's successor Licinius in the east. What followed were bitter power struggles and civil wars, as the empire turned against itself once again. In 312, Constantine marched on Rome to confront Maxentius. On the eve of the decisive Battle of the Milvian Bridge, Constantine reportedly had a divine vision, a cross in the sky accompanied by the words, "In this sign you shall conquer." He ordered his soldiers to mark their shields with the Christian symbol. Constantine triumphed. Maxentius drowned in the Tiber River during his retreat, and Constantine entered Rome victorious. One of his first acts was the Edict of Milan in 313, which legalized Christianity and marked a turning point for the once persecuted faith. Constantine then focused on Licinius in the east. After initial skirmishes, they joined forces to govern their halves of the empire, but peace was short-lived. In 324, Constantine defeated Licinius in battle, executing him and his son. The next year, Constantine stood alone as ruler of the entire Roman world. To mark his triumph, Constantine founded a new capital, Constantinople, on the site of the old Greek city Byzantium in 330. Strategically located between Europe and Asia, the city was adorned with forums, palaces, hippodromes, and churches rivaling old Rome. It soon became the thriving heart of the Eastern Empire. Meanwhile, pagan traditions declined as Constantine showered patronage on the Christian Church. He built grand basilicas like Old Saint, Peter's in Rome, and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. He intervened in church councils to help shape Christian doctrine. Though he waited until his deathbed to be baptized, Constantine set the empire firmly on the path to becoming a Christian state. Yet cracks remained. In 326, Constantine executed his eldest son, Crispus, and wife Fausta for unclear reasons. After his death in 337, the empire was again divided among his quarrelsome heirs. The Constantinian dynasty continued for a few decades, but was increasingly a house divided. Constantine's sons, Constantine II, Constantius II, and Constans, fought bitter civil wars. By 350, Constantius II emerged as sole ruler after his brothers died in battle. But in 355 he appointed his cousin Julian as Caesar, sending him to Gaul to guard the Rhine frontier. Julian scored surprising victories against Germanic invaders and became a hero to his troops. In 360, Julian was proclaimed Augustus, ruling emperor, against Constantius's wishes. Constantius died before they could clash, leaving Julian as sole emperor. His reign was short but transformative. Raised Christian, Julian rejected the faith and sought to revive paganism, earning the nickname Julian the Apostate. He purged Christians from imperial administration and launched a major campaign against Rome's old enemy Persia. But Julian was mortally wounded in battle in 363 and died without an heir, throwing the empire back into chaos. Over the next decades, emperors rose and fell in quick succession as rival generals vied for power. The frontiers crumbled under growing barbarian pressure. Meanwhile, the Christian transformation that Constantine began continued. In 380, Emperor Theodosius I made Christianity the official religion of the empire, banning pagan temples and rituals outright. Classical learning and literature were increasingly viewed through a Christian lens. The Germanic tribes, long held at bay, continued hammering at Rome's borders. For centuries, Rome had tried to pacify and assimilate these barbarians by settling them as federates, semi-autonomous allies, in exchange for peace and military service. But the arrangement was uneasy. Romans saw the Germans as uncivilized savages, while the Germans envied Roman wealth and power. Pressure mounted. In the frigid winter of 406, the Rhine froze solid, allowing tens of thousands of barbarians to pour across into the empire's heartland. Gaul was overrun by Alans, Sueves, and Vandals. The Romano-British were left to fend for themselves as the imperial government withdrew troops to face the crisis. Italy itself was sacked by Visigoths under King Alaric in 410, the first time in 800 years outsiders breached Rome's walls. These invasions sent shockwaves through the empire. A sense of impending doom gripped many Romans. The great Christian theologian St. Jerome, who witnessed the Visigoth depredations firsthand, lamented, "The bright light of all the world was put out. The Roman Empire was decapitated, and to speak more correctly, the whole world perished in one city." Rome's mighty legions, once guardians of vast frontiers, were shadows of their former selves, weakened by decades of infighting and a crumbling economy. Barbarian mercenaries now made up a large part of the army, often more loyal to their tribal leaders than the emperor. This was clear in the figure of Flavius Stilicho, a half-Vandal general who became the power behind the throne in the early 400s. Stilicho successfully repelled several barbarian invasions and effectively ruled the West on behalf of the young Emperor Honorius. But court rivals convinced Honorius that Stilicho planned to seize power. Stilicho was executed in 408, a devastating blow that left the West without a strong defender. As the 5th century progressed, the Western Empire slipped further into anarchy and decay. By then, effective control was limited to Italy and parts of Gaul and Spain. By the early 5th century, emperors in Ravenna had become little more than figureheads, while barbarian strongmen vied for real power. The Vandals seized North Africa in the 430s, cutting Rome off from its vital grain supplies and crippling the Western Empire's economy. The loss of Africa's tax revenues was another devastating blow. The line of Western emperors staggered on for a few more decades until 475 AD, when a general named Orestes staged a palace coup and installed his teenage son Romulus as a puppet emperor. The boy ruler was mockingly nicknamed Romulus Augustulus, meaning Little Augustus. But Orestes made a critical mistake. His army consisted mostly of Germanic mercenaries, including the Heruli, Syrii, and Rhogians. When he refused their demand for land in Italy as payment for their service, they mutinied under the leadership of a Germanic general named Odoacer. Odoacer's forces easily captured Ravenna, executed Orestes, and forced Romulus Augustulus to abdicate. According to some accounts, Odoacer spared the boy's life, granting him a pension and sending him to live with relatives in southern Italy. With no use for an emperor, Odoacer sent the imperial regalia back to Constantinople and proclaimed himself king of Italy. For all intents and purposes, the Western Roman Empire had ceased to exist. The date was September 4th, 476 AD, often cited as the fall of Rome. Yet, there was no single dramatic event that ended the empire. It had been crumbling slowly for decades, if not centuries. The sack of Rome in 410, the loss of Africa in the 430s, and the disappearance of an effective central government were all stages of a drawn-out decline. While 476 AD marked the end of a Western emperor, the Eastern Roman Empire, what we now call the Byzantine Empire, would endure nearly 1,000 years longer, until Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. Even then, Byzantines proudly called themselves Romans. The story of Rome's fall is complex, with no simple answers. Throughout this series, we've explored key factors: political instability, economic troubles, military threats, and cultural shifts. But perhaps the most important lesson is that empires, no matter how mighty, are ultimately fragile. The historian Edward Gibbon captured this well in The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. The decline of Rome was the natural and inevitable effect of immoderate greatness. Prosperity ripened the principle of decay. The causes of destruction multiplied with the extent of conquest. And as soon as time or accident had removed the artificial supports, the stupendous fabric yielded to the pressure of its own weight. In other words, the very things that made Rome great, its vast size, wealth, and diversity, also made it vulnerable. The empire grew too large to govern effectively, its economy too unequal to sustain, and its cosmopolitanism made unity difficult. Rome was a victim of its own success, but its legacy lived on. The Byzantine Empire carried Roman traditions in the East, while the barbarian kingdoms of the West, though dismantling Roman institutions, assimilated much of its culture, religion, and law. The idea of Rome, a universal empire uniting many peoples, continued to inspire conquerors from Charlemagne to Napoleon. Even the founders of the United States modeled their republic on Rome, down to the architecture of the Capitol building. So, while the Roman Empire fell, its spirit lingers. Its story of glory, grandeur, flaws, and frailties is a mirror of human civilization itself. It continues to fascinate and teach us about power, history, and the rise and fall of great civilizations. The barbarian tribes had long been a thorn in Rome's side, an endless source of conflict and instability along the empire's frontiers. For centuries, Roman generals fought to subdue them, to bring them under the imperial yoke. For a time, it worked. The Pax Romana extended its reach far beyond Italy, bringing order and prosperity to lands once wild and untamed. But as the empire began to crack under the strain of its own size and complexity, the old certainties began to crumble. The legions that once seemed invincible now struggled to hold the line against the surging tide of barbarian incursions. The first major blow came in 378 at the Battle of Adrianople, in present-day Turkey. There, a massive force of Goths, led by a chieftain named Fritigern, annihilated a Roman army and killed the Eastern Emperor Valens. It was a shocking defeat, one that shattered the aura of invincibility long surrounding Rome's legions. From then on, the floodgates were open. In 406, hordes of Vandals, Alans, and Suebi poured across the frozen Rhine into Gaul, setting the Western Empire ablaze. The Romans would never regain control of those lost territories. Meanwhile, the Huns were on the march, driving wave after wave of Germanic tribes before them as they moved westward from the steppes of Central Asia. The most famous of these Hunnic leaders was Attila. the so-called Scourge of God, whose armies ravaged the Balkans and Gaul in the 440s and 450s. Rome itself was not immune to the growing chaos. In 410, the unthinkable happened. For the first time in 800 years, the city was sacked by a foreign invader. An army of Visigoths, led by the warlord Alaric, breached the walls and plundered the Eternal City for 3 days, shocking the Roman world to its core. But perhaps the most devastating blow came a few decades later, in 455. The Vandals, one of the barbarian tribes that had crossed the Rhine half a century earlier, launched an invasion of Italy itself from their newly conquered territories in North Africa. Their king, Genseric, led his army on a scorched earth campaign up the peninsula, culminating in a brutal sack of Rome that lasted 2 weeks. The Vandals stripped the city of its riches, carrying off priceless treasures and thousands of captives. They even stripped the gold from the roof of the Temple of Jupiter, a potent symbol of Rome's faded glory. Yet the material damage paled in comparison to the psychological impact. The Vandals' sack marked the beginning of the end for the Western Empire. The emperors who followed were mere puppets, propped up by barbarian warlords who wielded real power behind the throne. The legions were a shadow of their former selves, unable to protect the empire's crumbling frontiers. Everywhere, the old order was dying. The cities of the West emptied out as trade collapsed and the middle class vanished. The great villas of the senatorial elite lay in ruins, their mosaics shattered and gardens overgrown. In the countryside, the old Roman system of latifundia, vast slave-worked agricultural estates, was breaking down, replaced by a new feudal order centered on local strongmen and their bands of retainers. Amidst all this chaos, the last emperors of the West clung to their thrones like drowning men grasping at driftwood. But their reigns were short and troubled, marred by coups, assassinations, and barbarian invasions. The end, when it came, was almost anticlimactic. In 476 A.D., a warlord named Odoacer deposed the young emperor Romulus Augustulus, sending the imperial regalia back to Constantinople with a message for the Eastern Emperor Zeno. The position of Western Emperor was no longer needed. Italy would henceforth be ruled by kings. And so, with a whimper rather than a bang, the Western Roman Empire came to an end. The great civilization that had dominated the Mediterranean world for centuries finally succumbed, to rot within and barbarians at the gates. But in the East, the empire that Constantine had founded endured for another 1,000 years. The Byzantine emperors ruled from Constantinople, presiding over a flourishing culture blending Greco-Roman traditions with Orthodox Christianity and the influences of the East. Even as the Western Empire crumbled, the Byzantines continued to build magnificent churches and palaces, sponsoring art and literature that would shape European culture for centuries to come. The walls of Constantinople held firm against wave after wave of would-be conquerors, from the Arabs to the Avars to the Russians. Not until 1453, when the Ottoman Turks finally breached those ancient ramparts, did the last remnant of the Roman Empire flicker out. By then, the world had moved on. The age of the Romans was long gone, and a new era was dawning, an era of knights and castles, crusades and cathedrals, the rise of Islam and voyages of discovery. Yet, in the shadow of all that followed, the memory of Rome endured for centuries. European rulers styled themselves as heirs to the Caesars, even as they grappled with the challenges of a rapidly changing world. The ruins of the Forum and the Colosseum became places of pilgrimage for generations of artists and intellectuals, inspiring works of art and literature that continue to resonate today. In the end, perhaps the true measure of Rome's greatness lies not in the empire's longevity or the vastness of its conquests, but in the enduring power of its legacy. Even as the physical structures of Roman civilization crumbled to dust, the ideas and values Rome bequeathed to the world, law and citizenship, art and literature, the inherent dignity of the human person, continued to shape history long after the last emperor had fallen. The story of Rome's downfall is a complex and multifaceted one, a centuries-long saga of war and peace, glory and decline, order and chaos. It is a story of great leaders and common soldiers, barbarian warlords and scheming bureaucrats, prophets and prelates, and ordinary men and women caught in the sweep of history. But above all, it is a story of the enduring resilience of the human spirit, the stubborn refusal of men and women to succumb to the tides of fate, even as the world they knew crumbled around them. In the end, the fall of Rome was not just a political or military event, but a human tragedy, a slow-motion cataclysm unfolding across generations, changing history in ways that would reverberate for centuries to come. As we come to the end of our journey through the tangled thicket of Roman decline, let us pause to reflect on the lessons this great civilization's downfall may hold for our own time. For even as we marvel at the grandeur and glory of ancient Rome, we must grapple with the harsh realities of its decline, the corrosive effects of corruption and decadence, the perils of overextension and imperial hubris, the dangers of religious strife and social unrest in an age of rapid change and global upheaval. These are lessons we would do well to heed. As the poet Shelley once wrote, lines that capture the essence of Rome's enduring legacy. The lone and level sands stretch far away, boundless and bare, and on the pedestal these words appear: "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains." The story of Rome is, in the end, the story of all great civilizations, a story of rise and fall, triumph and tragedy, the eternal cycle of creation and destruction at the heart of the human experience. It is a story that continues to resonate through the ages, inviting us to ponder the fragility of even the mightiest empires and the enduring power of the human spirit to rise from the ashes of defeat. And so, as we drift off to sleep, let us dream of Rome, its glory and grandeur, its decadence and decline. Let us dream of the great men and women who shaped its destiny, and of the ordinary people who lived, loved, and struggled in its shadow. And let us hold fast to the lessons this great civilization's story may hold for our own time. Lessons of courage and compassion, resilience and renewal, and the abiding hope that even in the darkest times, the human spirit will endure. In the 3rd century, an emperor would come to power only to be deposed or assassinated by the Praetorians when they grew dissatisfied or were swayed by a rival who promised them a better deal. One notorious example was Emperor Pertinax. He had come to power in 193 A.D. with the blessing of the Praetorian Guard, who had assassinated his predecessor Commodus. But Pertinax quickly lost their favor when he tried to impose stricter military discipline and frugal economic reforms. After a mere 87 days in power, Pertinax was confronted by a group of angry Praetorians. When he tried to reason with them, he was promptly stabbed to death. What happened next almost defies belief. The Praetorians, having just murdered an emperor, decided to auction off the imperial throne to the highest bidder. The winner was a wealthy senator named Didius Julianus, who promised each Praetorian guardsman a whopping 25,000 sesterces, equivalent to several years' salary. Julianus enjoyed a brief reign before being ousted and executed by a rival general just 2 months later. The Praetorians, it seemed, were loyal only to money and their own interests, while the Praetorian Guard wreaked havoc in Rome. The empire faced a different kind of threat on its frontiers. For centuries, skillful diplomacy, strategic alliances, and occasional demonstrations of military might had kept the Germanic tribes at bay. But, as the internal chaos of the 3rd century crisis weakened Rome's grip, the barbarians grew more restless and daring in their incursions into imperial territory. The empire had always had an uneasy relationship with the Gothic people who inhabited the region north of the Danube River. They were first mentioned by name in a lost work by the 3rd century historian Cassius Dio, who wrote of a battle in 238 AD, where the Goths slaughtered a force of Roman soldiers and took many captives. But the most shocking blow came in the year 251, when the Goths defeated and killed the Roman Emperor Decius in the Battle of Abritus. Decius had been campaigning against the Goths, trying to push them back from the Danube frontier, but he fell into a trap set by the Gothic king Cniva near the town of Abritus in modern-day Bulgaria. The Roman army was surrounded and massacred in the swampy terrain. Decius and his son were among the fallen, becoming the first Roman emperors to ever be killed in battle against a foreign enemy. It was a psychological blow from which the empire would never fully recover. The invincible aura of Rome had been shattered. The humiliation at Abritus was still a fresh wound when, just 9 years later, the unthinkable happened. The Emperor Valerian, who had succeeded Decius, was campaigning against the Persian Empire in the east. In 260 AD, Valerian arranged to meet the Persian king Shapur-Atur to negotiate an end to the conflict. But the meeting was a trap. Valerian was captured and would spend the rest of his life as a prisoner of the Persians, an immense embarrassment for Rome. Shapur, in a form of ancient psychological warfare, was said to have used the captive Valerian as a human footstool when mounting his horse. Upon Valerian's death, his skin was allegedly flayed, stuffed with straw, and preserved as a trophy in a Persian temple. The message was clear. The Romans, for all their military might and aura of invincibility, could be brought low by a cunning adversary. Back in Rome, Valerian's son Gallienus took the imperial throne, but his claim to rule was immediately under threat. With the empire in such a vulnerable state, regional commanders began to break away and proclaim themselves independent rulers. In the east, a province called Palmyra, led by a charismatic queen named Zenobia, declared its independence and seized Egypt and much of Asia Minor. In the west, a general named Postumus established a breakaway regime in Gaul, Britain, and parts of Spain, the so-called Gallic Empire. For over a decade, Gallienus struggled to hold the empire together against these secessionist threats, all while beating back further invasions by the Goths and Alemanni along the Danube and Rhine frontiers. By the time he was assassinated by his own troops in 268, the Roman Empire was in very real danger of total collapse. Into this chaotic scene stepped Gallienus's successor, Claudius II, who would come to be known as Claudius Gothicus, the conqueror of the Goths. A respected general and capable leader, Claudius won a series of decisive victories over the Goths, including the massive Battle of Nisus in 268 or 269, though modern historians debate the scale of the battle, with ancient sources claiming wildly inflated casualty figures. There's no doubt it was a badly needed morale boost for the beleaguered Romans. Claudius Gothicus did not have long to savor his triumphs. He fell ill and died of plague in 270. But he was succeeded by another great general, Aurelian, who would finally restore some semblance of order to the empire. Aurelian first dealt with the breakaway regions, reconquering Palmyra and its famous queen. In 272, Zenobia was captured and brought back to Rome, where she was paraded in golden chains during Aurelian's triumph, an extravagant victory celebration. With Palmyra subdued, Aurelian turned his attention to the Gallic Empire. In a series of battles, he defeated Postumus's successor Tetrarchus and reunified the western provinces with the rest of the empire. For the first time in over 15 years, the Roman Empire was once again under the rule of a single emperor. Though Aurelian himself soon fell victim to assassination, the fate of so many soldier emperors in this turbulent era, he had pulled the empire back from the brink of destruction and set the stage for a much-needed period of reform and renewal under Emperor Diocletian. The Aurelian walls of Rome stand as a monument to this precarious time. Aurelian recognized that invasions and civil wars were bringing the threat of attack ever closer to the imperial capital itself. Though Rome had long taken pride in not needing fortifications, that age of confidence was over. The 12-mile circuit of walls, with their imposing gates and defensive towers, underscored that even the Eternal City was no longer invincible. As we've explored, the crisis years of the 3rd century saw Rome brought to its knees by a combination of weak, unstable leadership, barbarian incursions, and breakaway territories that challenged the very idea of a unified empire under a single ruler. While Aurelian had stopped the bleeding, the underlying rot remained. It would fall to his successor Diocletian to take the next step, radically reforming the very structure of the empire in a last-ditch effort to save Rome from collapse. When Diocletian took the throne in 284 AD, he faced an empire that was a far cry from the confident, conquering colossus of centuries past. The borders were still under threat, the treasury was depleted, and the imperial throne had become a game of musical chairs, with whoever had the strongest army claiming the title before being dispatched by the next rival in line. Diocletian, who had risen through the ranks of the army himself, understood that tinkering around the edges would no longer suffice. Only a top-to-bottom reform of the imperial system could hope to stave off collapse. At the heart of Diocletian's reforms was the Tetrarchy, or Rule of Four. He recognized that the empire had simply grown too vast and unwieldy to be effectively governed by a single emperor. His solution was to divide power between 4 co-emperors, 2 senior Augusti and 2 junior Caesars, each responsible for a quarter of the empire. When an Augustus died or retired, his Caesar would be promoted to take his place, and a new Caesar would be appointed. It was, in theory, an orderly system of succession that would put an end to the cycle of civil wars. To further improve efficiency, Diocletian vastly expanded the bureaucracy, creating a complex hierarchy of provincial governors, vicars, and praetorian prefects to manage the day-to-day business of the empire. The number of provinces was nearly doubled, from 48 to 85, to make administration more manageable. Diocletian also sought to address the empire's economic woes with his Edict on Maximum Prices in 301 AD, an attempt to curb rampant inflation by setting price ceilings on goods and services. While well-intentioned, the edict was ultimately unsuccessful and difficult to enforce. But perhaps most significantly, Diocletian saw the spread of Christianity as a threat to imperial stability. In 303 AD, he issued a series of edicts ordering the destruction of churches, the burning of scriptures, and the imprisonment of clergy. Christians were barred from holding public office and could be compelled to make sacrifices to the Roman gods or face execution. It was the most severe persecution Christians had yet faced in the empire. Many met a martyr's fate in the arenas, including St. George, now immortalized as the patron saint of England. Despite the persecutions, Christianity continued to spread, and Diocletian's efforts to stamp it out would ultimately prove futile. In 305 AD, at the age of 60, Diocletian made the surprising decision to retire, becoming the first Roman emperor to voluntarily abdicate the throne. He retreated to his lavish palace on the Dalmatian coast, where he was said to have spent his days gardening. When asked to return to power a few years later, he reportedly replied, "If you could show the cabbage that I planted with my own hands to your emperor, he definitely wouldn't dare suggest that I replace the peace and happiness of this place with the storms of a never-satisfied greed." But Diocletian's dream of a peaceful retirement was not to be. Without his firm hand at the helm, the Tetrarchy he had created quickly began to unravel. The Augusti and Caesars jockeyed for position, each seeking to become the sole ruler of the empire. The result was another round of civil wars as rival claimants battled for supremacy. In the end, it was an ambitious young general named Constantine who would emerge victorious and take the empire in a radical new direction. The rise of Constantine marked a true turning point in Roman history. His reign saw the empire's official embrace of Christianity, the foundation of a new capital in the east, and a further centralization of imperial power. But to understand Constantine's impact, we must first delve into the story of his unlikely rise, from obscure soldier to emperor of the Romans. Constantine was born around the year 272 AD in the city of Nisus, in what is now Serbia. His father, Constantius, was an officer in the Roman army who would eventually rise to the rank of Augustus under Diocletian's Tetrarchy. Constantine's mother, Helena, was of humble birth, and there were even rumors that she had worked in a tavern. But Constantine's parentage would prove less important than his own ambition and military skill. As a young man, Constantine served as a soldier in the court of Diocletian in the Eastern Empire. He quickly made a name for himself as a brave and capable warrior. When Diocletian abdicated in 305 AD, Constantine's father, Constantius, became Augustus of the Western Empire. Constantine, now in his early 30s, expected to be named as his father's Caesar, but he was passed over in favor of a man named Severus. Disappointed but undeterred, Constantine bided his time. When his father fell ill and died in Britain in 306 AD, Constantine was at his side. The army immediately proclaimed Constantine as Augustus, but this was not recognized by Galerius, the senior Augustus in the east. Galerius instead named Severus as Western Augustus and Constantine as Caesar. It was a tense situation with multiple claimants vying for power. The next few years were a complex web of alliances, betrayals, and battles as Constantine maneuvered to secure his position. he formed an alliance with Maxentius, the son of Maximian, a former Augustus who had been forced to abdicate along with Diocletian. Together, they defeated and killed Severus, but the alliance soon soured, and Constantine and Maxentius became bitter rivals. The stage was set for a showdown between the two men in 312 AD. Maxentius was based in Rome and had a larger army. Constantine was in the north with a smaller force. But as Constantine marched toward Rome, he had a vision that would change the course of history. According to the account of Eusebius, Constantine's biographer, the emperor saw a cross of light in the sky above the sun, along with the words, "In this sign, conquer." Inspired by this vision, Constantine ordered his soldiers to paint the Christian symbol of the Chi-Rho, the first two letters of Christ in Greek, on their shields. When the two armies met at the Battle of Milvian Bridge, just outside Rome, Constantine emerged victorious. Maxentius drowned in the Tiber River as he tried to flee. Constantine entered Rome in triumph, and the Senate proclaimed him the Senior Augustus. The Battle of Milvian Bridge was a pivotal moment, not just for Constantine, but for the empire as a whole. It marked the beginning of Constantine's embrace of Christianity, which would have far-reaching consequences. In 313 AD, Constantine met with the Eastern Emperor Licinius, and together they issued the Edict of Milan, which granted religious tolerance throughout the empire and ended the persecutions of Christians. Over the next decade, Constantine gradually strengthened his position and eliminated his rivals one by one. In 324 AD, he defeated Licinius and became the sole ruler of the Roman Empire. He was now free to implement his vision of a Christian empire. In 325 AD, he convened the First Council of Nicaea, which sought to resolve disputes about the nature of Christ and establish orthodox Christian doctrine. But perhaps Constantine's most lasting legacy was the foundation of a new capital in the East. He chose the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, strategically located on the Bosphorus Strait. Over the next 6 years, the city was dramatically rebuilt and expanded. Walls were strengthened, brand new public buildings and churches were erected, and the city was filled with art from across the empire. In 330 AD, in an elaborate ceremony, the city was officially dedicated as Constantinople, the new Rome. The foundation of Constantinople recognized that the empire's center of gravity was shifting eastward. Rome would remain a ceremonial capital, but Constantinople would be the new seat of imperial power. It was a bold move that looked toward the empire's future rather than its past. When Constantine died in 337 AD, he was the first Roman emperor to be baptized on his deathbed. He left behind an empire vastly different from the one he had inherited. Christianity was now the favored religion, the imperial capital had moved east, and power was more centralized than ever in the hands of the emperor. But Constantine also left behind a problem. He failed to create a clear plan for succession. His death sparked yet another round of civil wars, as his sons and nephews fought for control of the empire. The unified empire Constantine had built would not last long beyond his death. By 395 AD, less than 60 years later, the empire officially split into eastern and western halves, never to be reunited. As we move into the twilight years of the Western Empire, we find a shadow of its former self, ravaged by invasions, drained by constant warfare and infighting. The once mighty Roman Empire in the West was in irreversible decline. The world of the 5th century was one where the empire was no longer the dominant force it had been. Instead, it struggled for survival amid a sea of barbarian kingdoms. At the dawn of the 5th century, the Visigoths, a branch of the Gothic people, were on the move. Pushed westward by the Huns, fierce nomads from Central Asia, they pressed on the empire's Danubian frontier. In 401 AD, under their king Alaric, the Visigoths invaded Italy itself. The Western Emperor Honorius, safe behind the marshes and walls of Ravenna, could do little to stop them. For the next decade, Alaric and his Visigoths ranged across the Balkans and Italy, alternately fighting against and serving as federati, Roman allies in the army. The line between invader and mercenary had become blurred. In 408 AD, with the empire distracted by internal power struggles, Alaric saw his chance. He led his army to the gates of Rome and besieged the city. Rome had not been besieged by a foreign army for centuries. The shock and terror of its citizens must have been unimaginable. The once unassailable capital, the heart of a mighty empire, was now at the mercy of a barbarian king. After months of blockade and negotiation, Alaric lifted the siege in exchange for a massive payment of gold and silver, but it was only a temporary reprieve. In 410 AD, after further political intrigues and broken promises by the Romans, Alaric's patience ran out. This time, when he marched on Rome, he took the city by force. For 3 days, Rome was sacked, a moment that shocked the ancient world to its core. What was the point of claiming a title that had lost all meaning? Instead, Odoacer took the title Rex Italiae, King of Italy. He sent the imperial regalia of the deposed Romulus Augustulus to the Eastern Emperor Zeno in Constantinople, along with a message stating that the West no longer required a separate emperor. The Western Roman Empire was no more. For nearly a century afterward, historians would continue to speak of a separate Western Empire, but this was mere semantics, a hollow echo of past glory. In reality, Odoacer's ascension marked the true end of Roman rule in the West. The barbarian warlord, who had once served as a mercenary for Rome, now sat upon the throne of Italy, while the imperial court in Ravenna faded into myth and legend. Odoacer ruled Italy as a relatively stable and prosperous kingdom for the next 13 years. In many ways, his reign was not so different from that of the later Western emperors. He made use of the old Roman bureaucracy and infrastructure, issued coins in his name, and negotiated with the Eastern Empire as a nominal subordinate, much as his imperial predecessors had done. But Odoacer was, in the end, still a barbarian king, not a Roman emperor. His rise marked a fundamental shift in the political order of the Mediterranean world. The last thin veneer of Roman legitimacy had been stripped away, revealing the naked truth that real political and military power now lay firmly in the hands of the Germanic warlords who had once been derided as uncouth savages. The fall of Romulus Augustulus and the ascent of Odoacer mark the moment when the great story of ancient Rome finally reached its long-delayed conclusion. The eternal city would endure, as would the eastern half of the empire ruled from distant Constantinople. But the dream of a unified Mediterranean world, bound together under the aegis of Rome's law and legion, had at last faded into the realm of nostalgia and romance. The Western Empire was gone, and the long twilight of late antiquity had given way to the dawn of a new era, the Middle Ages. It would be a time of great change and upheaval, when the old certainties of classical civilization would be swept away and replaced by new powers, new faiths, and new ways of looking at the world. The monks and knights of medieval Christendom would look back on ancient Rome as a golden age of supreme power and decadence. Meanwhile, the Muslim caliphs who conquered the southern and eastern shores of the Mediterranean would see themselves as the rightful heirs to Rome's imperial grandeur. But for all the centuries that separated them from antiquity, the men and women of the Middle Ages could never entirely escape the shadow of Rome, the language of Latin, the Roman style of art and architecture, the legal codes of Justinian and Theodosius, the ideal of a universal empire ordained by God. All of these would shape the medieval world in profound and lasting ways, even as the political reality of the Roman Empire receded further into the mists of legend. Perhaps then it is fitting that the Western Roman Empire breathed its last under a ruler named Romulus. According to ancient tales, it was another Romulus who had founded Rome some 12 centuries earlier. Romulus, the first king who built his city on the 7 hills and populated it with fugitives and outcasts. Now, with the abdication of Romulus Augustulus, the story had come full circle. The kingdom of Romulus had ended with the kingdom of another Romulus. The cycle was complete. Of course, the true reasons for Rome's fall were far more complex than the story of 2 bookending Romuli. Over the course of our journey through the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, we've explored the myriad factors that contributed to the slow unraveling of the world's greatest superpower: economic instability, political corruption, religious upheaval, barbarian invasions, all played their part in bringing the mighty colossus of Rome to its knees. But in the end, perhaps the most important lesson we can take from Rome's decline is a simple one. No empire, no matter how grand or long-lived, can last forever. Every great power must someday face its own inevitable twilight. This is the fundamental truth that connects the fall of Rome to the rise and fall of so many other imperial powers throughout history, from the ancient empires of Persia and China to the colonial powers of the early modern period, from the British Empire at its Victorian zenith to the United States in the 21st century. The same underlying patterns can be seen time and time again. Prosperity breeds complacency, power breeds corruption, expansion breeds overreach. The mightiest empires may take centuries to fall, but fall they always do. The end of Roman power in the West was a pivotal turning point in the grand sweep of human history. It marked the boundary between the classical and medieval periods, the hinge that connected the world of Caesar and Cicero to the world of Charlemagne and William the Conqueror. The centuries that followed Rome's fall would see wrenching changes in every aspect of Western culture, from art and architecture to religion and politics, to language and literature. Yet the Eternal City itself would endure, rising from its early medieval nadir to once again become a center of power and culture. The Rome of the popes and the Renaissance was in many ways a very different place from the Rome of Augustus and Trajan, but it was still unmistakably Rome, a living link to the vanished world of antiquity. In the end, perhaps it is this enduring legacy more than anything else that defines Rome's place in the story of human civilization. Long after the last emperor had surrendered his throne, long after the aqueducts and amphitheaters had crumbled to ruin, the idea of Rome lived on. The dream of a universal civilization, a world bound together by law and learning, by shared values and a common heritage, And so, even as we bid farewell to Romulus Augustulus and the fading remnants of the Western Empire, we cannot help but feel a sense of awe at the sheer scale and grandeur of the Roman achievement. For all its flaws and contradictions, for all the blood and toil and oppression that marked its rise and fall, there has never been anything quite like Rome before or since. It was and remains one of the great pivot points of human history, the hinge on which the fate of nations and peoples has so often turned. As we drift off to sleep, our minds filled with images of marble columns and imperial purple, of barbarian warlords and exiled boy emperors, we can perhaps take some small comfort in the knowledge that the story of Rome is in the end the story of all of us. It is the story of how a small, muddy village on the banks of the Tiber rose to conquer the world, only to be brought low by the weight of its own greatness. It is a mirror in which we can see reflected the hopes and fears, the triumphs and tragedies of our own civilization. And so, in the quiet hours of the night, let us dream of Rome as it once was, and will never be again. A city of gods and emperors, of glory and decadence, of power and beauty unmatched in human history. Let us wander its ancient streets and marvel at its timeless grandeur, even as we whisper a soft and reverent farewell to the last fading light of the Western Empire. Ave Roma Aeterna, eternal Rome. How far the glory of Rome had fallen was starkly revealed by these events. The ripples of this unprecedented disaster spread far and wide. In the absence of a strong central authority, ambitious regional commanders seized power for themselves. The Gallic Empire broke away in the west, controlling Britain, Gaul, and Spain, while in the east the Palmyrene Empire asserted sovereignty over the crucial provinces of Syria and Egypt. For nearly 15 years, these breakaway states challenged the supremacy of Rome, effectively fracturing what had once been the world's greatest superpower. To put this in modern terms, imagine if the United States suddenly lost control over California and Texas, and these states declared themselves independent nations, wielding power and resources previously under federal control. The Roman Empire's days as the undisputed master of the Mediterranean were definitively over. The crisis of the 3rd century starkly demonstrated that the imperial system was not invincible. Cracks in the political foundations, economic bedrock, and military might had become deep fissures that could and did bring even the greatest superpower to its knees. Although Rome would endure for another 2 centuries, many historians consider this crisis the true beginning of its terminal decline. It would take a leader of exceptional ability and vision to pull the empire back from the brink, to mend its fractures, and set it on a path toward stability. Fortunately for Rome, such a man was waiting in the wings: Diocletian, who would institute the most sweeping reforms the Roman world had ever witnessed. Born to a humble family in the province of Dalmatia around 244 A.D., Diocletian's rise to power seemed improbable. His early career was marked by distinguished military service, notably within the elite cavalry corps, and eventually the imperial bodyguard. But his opportunity came suddenly and dramatically when his patron, Emperor Numerian, died under mysterious circumstances during a Persian campaign in 284 A.D. Backed by loyal troops, Diocletian was proclaimed emperor and swiftly eliminated his rivals. At age 40, the son of a provincial scribe now ruled the vast Roman world. Diocletian moved quickly and decisively, recognizing the sheer size and complexity of the empire made it impossible for a single man to govern effectively, he introduced the Tetrarchy, or rule of four. The empire was divided into eastern and western halves, each ruled by a senior emperor called an Augustus, and a junior emperor called a Caesar, who acted as a deputy and designated successor. Diocletian ruled as Augustus in the east, while Maximian governed the west. The Caesars, Galerius and Constantius, commanded armies on the frontiers, ensuring military defense and facilitating orderly succession. This was a revolutionary system of shared power and planned succession, aimed at preventing the civil wars and chaos that had plagued Rome during the 3rd century. To improve administration, Diocletian also doubled the number of provinces, from 50 to nearly 100, grouping them into larger units called dioceses, governed by vicari. Though this layered bureaucracy sometimes slowed decisions, it allowed imperial authority to penetrate more deeply into local affairs than ever before. Economically, Diocletian faced a daunting challenge: rampant inflation and a devalued currency. In an ambitious but ultimately flawed attempt to stabilize the economy, he issued the Edict on Maximum Prices in 301 AD. This edict set strict price ceilings on over 1,000 goods and services, from ivory and legal fees to foodstuffs like dates and lettuce. Violations were punishable by death. However, like many attempts at top-down price controls throughout history, the edict backfired spectacularly. Merchants refused to sell at the artificially low prices. Shortages appeared, and a thriving black market emerged. The edict became unenforceable and was largely ignored. Perhaps the most notorious aspect of Diocletian's reign was his persecution of Christians. Unlike the scattered and localized persecutions of the past, Diocletian launched an empire-wide campaign to suppress Christianity, which he viewed as a dangerous threat to traditional Roman religious values and unity. Beginning in 303 AD, Christian scriptures and places of worship were ordered destroyed. Christians were stripped of legal rights, barred from public office, and compelled to perform sacrifices to Roman gods. Those who refused faced imprisonment, torture, and execution. Stories of martyrdom, Christians thrown to beasts, burned alive, or worked to death, echoed throughout the empire. Ironically, this persecution did not extinguish Christianity, but rather strengthened it, forging a generation of martyrs who inspired later followers. Within a few decades, Christianity would transform from a persecuted sect into the favored religion of the empire under Constantine the Great. After a remarkable 20-year reign, Diocletian voluntarily abdicated in 305 AD, becoming the first Roman emperor to retire from office. He withdrew to his vast palace in Dalmatia, living out his days in relative peace, tending to his gardens, far removed from the political turmoil of Rome. However, the tetrarchic system Diocletian crafted unraveled quickly after his departure. The carefully planned succession collapsed into rivalries and civil wars as co-emperors schemed against one another. It seemed the empire was doomed to slip back into chaos. Yet, despite its ultimate failure, Diocletian's reign bought the empire precious time. His military victories secured borders, administrative reforms restored some control, and his bold actions, whether successful or not, demonstrated imperial resolve. Most importantly, Diocletian transformed the very nature of imperial authority. No longer was the emperor simply the first citizen bound by republican tradition. Instead, he became an absolute monarch, adorned in imperial purple, wearing a jeweled diadem, and regarded as sacred and inviolable. His word was law. This model of divine kingship became the blueprint for monarchs throughout Europe and the Mediterranean for centuries to come. Yet Diocletian's reign also marked a point of no return. The days of Roman expansion and classical splendor were over. The empire was entering its twilight years. The sun was setting on the Rome of marble temples and triumphant processions. But as that light faded, a new Rome was rising in the east. The stage was set for the rise of Constantinople and the birth of the Byzantine Empire, the continuation of Roman legacy in a Christian form. As the Western Roman Empire breathed its last, the world shifted on its axis. The grand empire that once stretched from the misty highlands of Britannia to the deserts of Syria, the civilization that had given us the Colosseum, the aqueduct, and the Pax Romana, was no more. In its place rose a patchwork of Germanic kingdoms, each eager to claim a piece of Rome's heritage. But what of the Eastern Empire? From his glittering capital at Constantinople, Emperor Zeno gazed westward with weary eyes. The East had weathered the storm far better than the West. The Huns and Goths battered its borders, but Constantinople's walls held firm. The imperial bureaucracy, the economy, and the military remained intact. Still, Zeno knew his throne was precarious. The Eastern Empire was forever altered. Gone were the days of legions expanding the empire's frontiers. Now, the priority was defense, holding on to what remained. The Eastern Empire increasingly turned inward, consumed by palace intrigues, theological debates, and religious controversies. The world outside its walls shifted and changed. Greek, not Latin, became the lingua franca. The imperial cult faded as Christianity rose to dominance. The once proud Senate was reduced to a mere rubber stamp. Yet the people clung fiercely to their Roman identity. They called themselves Romans, Romaioi, even as centuries slipped by and the ancient empire faded into memory. For over 1,000 years, this Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire endured. Its story was one of soaring triumphs and crushing defeats, golden ages and dark catastrophes. During the reign of Justinian the Great in the 6th century, the empire briefly reclaimed parts of the lost western territories, from the steppes of Ukraine to the shores of Tunisia. Justinian's ambitious reconquests, however, proved fleeting, undone by overstretched resources, relentless enemies, and the unstoppable tides of history. The Byzantines faced foes on all sides: Arabs, Persians, Slavs, Normans, and Turks. They dazzled the world with the splendor of the Hagia Sophia, even as their armies fought for survival. The great palace of Constantinople witnessed the rise of ruthless strongmen and feeble figureheads, generals and bureaucrats, saints and sinners. Time and again, the empire teetered on the brink of destruction, only to find hidden reserves of strength and resilience. But no empire, no matter how resilient, lasts forever. Dynasties came and went: Macedonians, Komneni, Palaiologoi, each unable to halt the steady decline. In 1204, Latin crusaders shocked Christendom by sacking Constantinople, an unthinkable humiliation inflicted by supposed allies. The Ottoman Turks gradually carved away the empire's territories until the once mighty realm was reduced to the city itself. The end, when it came, was almost anticlimactic. On May 29th, 1453, after a prolonged siege, the Ottomans breached the city walls. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, tore the imperial regalia from his body and plunged into the final battle, never to be seen again. With that, the Roman dream was over. The empire of Augustus and Trajan, Constantine and Justinian, had finally met an enemy it could not outlast. Rome's downfall is a story woven with human folly, unforeseen chance, bold decisions, and missed opportunities. It reminds us that no matter how mighty, every empire eventually faces its twilight. Yet, for all the centuries since Rome's fall, its legacy endures in our language, laws, art, and worldview. The Eternal City casts a long shadow over history. So, my fellow armchair historian, we come to the end of our journey through Rome's tumultuous final centuries. May this exploration of antiquity be a companion on your journey to dreamland. If this peek into the past has piqued your curiosity, consider subscribing for many more stories from the vast tapestry of history. For now, close your eyes, let my voice fade into the distance, and drift off to visions of emperors and legions, a world both strange and strangely familiar. Sweet dreams.